The silence that fell over the Pemberton Grand Ballroom that October night in 1847 was more deafening than any symphony ever performed within its gilded walls. Lady Cordelia Ashworth, heiress to one of England's oldest fortunes, stood motionless in the center of the Italian marble hall, 300 pairs of eyes watching her with a mixture of thinly veiled disdain and morbid curiosity. Her entrance had provoked not applause or respectful bows, but a collective murmur that echoed through the Corinthian columns like the buzzing of malicious bees. Her champagne-colored French silk gown, specially commissioned from Paris by the era's finest couturiers, had cost a fortune that could sustain a merchant family for decades. Yet, neither all her father Lord Ashworth's gold, nor all the French tailor's skill could disguise what London society considered her most glaring flaw. Cordelia possessed proportions that defied the Victorian aristocracy's beauty standards. At 22, she carried not only the weight of her £100,000 annual inheritance, but also the burden of a body that high society deemed unsuitable for the empire's most refined ballrooms. Lady Pemberton, hostess of what was considered the most prestigious reception of the London social season, approached Cordelia with the calculated elegance of one born to command salons. Her words, uttered softly enough to maintain appearances but loud enough for the nearest ladies to hear, cut through the air like sharp blades. The hostess expressed her delight at receiving young Ashworth, but her icy eyes made it clear that such a presence was tolerated only in deference to the family's financial power and ancient lineage. Cordelia's father, Lord Edmund Ashworth, watched the scene from the other end of the ballroom, where he conversed with other lords about parliamentary matters and investments in the burgeoning coal industries. Even from a distance, Cordelia could feel the weight of his silent expectation. Edmund had built his fortune not only through family inheritance, but by expanding business beyond traditional rural estates, investing in railways and textile factories that were transforming England into an industrial power. He hoped his only daughter would make a marriage that would not only consolidate their social position, but also bring valuable political connections for the family's ventures. The season's young debutantes, all slender as reeds and dressed in the latest creations from Worth and other renowned couturiers, formed small groups near the windows overlooking the illuminated gardens. Cordelia had known each of them since childhood. They had attended the same French governesses, learned piano from the same German masters, and studied watercolor with the same Italian teachers. Yet, at that moment, they observed her as if she were a strange invader in their sacred territory. Lady Margaret Fairfax, daughter of the Earl of Westmoreland, and considered one of the season's most coveted beauties, murmured something into her companion's ears that provoked a wave of muffled giggles behind silk fans. Cordelia didn't need to hear the words to understand their content. She had experienced variations of the same cruelty at every social event for the past 5 years, ever since she had reached the appropriate age to frequent high society circles. The orchestrina hired for the occasion, composed of musicians directly from the Vienna Conservatory, began a Strauss waltz that echoed through the painted mythological arches. It was the signal for gentlemen to approach ladies to request dances, initiating the complex ritual of aristocratic courtship. Cordelia positioned herself near one of the columns, a spot that allowed her to observe the entire ballroom while remaining relatively protected from the crueler gazes. One by one, the young aristocrats approached the debutantes with studied bows and calculated smiles. Lord Pemberton, the hostess's son, addressed Lady Margaret with the confidence of one who knew he would be well received. The Honourable Charles Whitmore, heir to a fortune in rural estates, chose Lady Elizabeth Thornton, whose platinum beauty was discussed in all of London's salons. Even the less fortunate gentlemen, or those with less impressive titles, found their partners among the available young ladies. Cordelia watched it all with the dignity that years of aristocratic education had taught her to maintain, even as she felt the heat of humiliation rise up her neck and flush her cheeks. She knew this ritual. She had experienced it countless times in previous seasons. She would remain there, elegant and serene in her forced solitude, until it was socially acceptable to retreat to the adjacent drawing rooms, where older ladies played whist and commented on the season's marital alliances. It was then that the double doors of the ballroom opened once more, and a different silence, laden with genuine expectation and reverence, descended upon the assembly. The butler announced, with the solemnity reserved only for the highest titles, the arrival of His Grace, the Duke of Ravenshollow. Alexander Blackwood, the 7th Duke of Ravenshollow, entered the ballroom with the natural authority of one who commanded not only one of England's greatest fortunes, but also political influence that extended to the corridors of Whitehall. At 31, he possessed the rare combination of an ancient title, substantial wealth, and an appearance that made aristocratic mothers devise complex strategies to capture his attention for their daughters. His reputation, however, was that of a man impossible to conquer. In 12 social seasons, he had never shown genuine interest in any of the candidates presented by London society. The Duke greeted Lady Pemberton with the courtesy required by protocol, but his dark eyes swept the ballroom in a calculated manner, like a general assessing a battlefield. Alexander had learned early on that every social event was simultaneously entertainment and a political arena, where alliances were forged and destroyed between a waltz and a minuet. His presence that night was not casual. Urgent matters related to the ducal succession weighed on his shoulders like an invisible armor. 3 months prior, his private solicitor, Mr. Pemberton of Pemberton and Associates, had presented documents revealing a specific clause in his grandfather, the 5th Duke's, will, the full inheritance of the Ravenshollow domains, including properties in Yorkshire, coal mines in Durham, and investments in the East Indies, would only be fully transferred if Alexander married before his 32nd birthday. Otherwise, half the fortune would be bequeathed to his distant cousin, Lord Pemberton, known for his administrative incompetence and gambling tendencies. The deadline set by the will would expire in exactly 6 months. Alexander had spent years building a commercial empire that stretched from the docks of London to the tea plantations of Ceylon, and the prospect of seeing half his life's work in the hands of a fool was intolerable. However, choosing a wife presented complexities that transcended romantic considerations. She would need to be capable of navigating court intrigues, managing a ducal household with over 200 employees, and representing the Blackwood family in international diplomatic circles. As he watched the young debutantes perform the elaborate steps of the Viennese waltz, Alexander reflected on the obvious candidates. Lady Margaret Fairfax possessed unquestionable beauty and an impeccable aristocratic pedigree, but her conversations revealed a superficial mind interested only in Parisian fashions and social gossip. Lady Elizabeth Thornton showed greater intelligence, but her family was embroiled in financial scandals related to failed speculative investments in American railways. His considerations were interrupted by the approach of Lord Ashworth, a man whose reputation in London's commercial circles was notable. Edmund Ashworth had transformed traditional rural properties into a diversified network of investments that included stakes in shipping companies, textile factories in northern England, and more recently, substantial shares in the new telegraph lines connecting London to Edinburgh. Alexander respected men who understood that true 19th century nobility required adaptation to modern economic realities. Lord Ashworth addressed the Duke with carefully chosen words about parliamentary issues related to the expansion of railways in the Indian colonies, a topic on which Alexander possessed specialized knowledge due to his own investments in the region. The conversation flowed naturally into discussions about emerging commercial opportunities in America, where both had made significant investments in cotton plantations and mining companies. During this conversation, Alexander first noticed Lady Cordelia Ashworth's presence. She remained near one of the decorated columns, observing the ballroom with a serenity that contrasted sharply with the artificial bustle of the other young women present. Her French silk gown evidenced the refinement of her education, but Alexander immediately understood why she had been left without dance partners. London society was unforgiving of any deviation from its rigid standards of feminine beauty. Yet, something in Cordelia's dignified posture caught the Duke's attention. While other young women displayed obvious nervousness or desperate attempts to attract male attention, she maintained a composure that suggested considerable inner strength. Alexander had learned through years of managing estates and negotiating with financiers that appearances often deceived, and that qualities like intelligence and determination held far greater value than ephemeral beauty. Lord Ashworth, noticing the ducal gaze, discreetly mentioned that his daughter had received an exceptional education. She spoke French, German, and Italian fluently, possessed advanced knowledge of classical literature and ancient history, and showed remarkable aptitude for matters related to family estate administration. More importantly, she had assisted her father in various commercial negotiations, revealing a sophisticated understanding of modern financial complexities. This information genuinely piqued Alexander's interest. A duchess who could intellectually contribute to the administration of the Ravenshollow domains would be a valuable asset, especially considering the international expansion of his businesses. He began to contemplate possibilities that transcended the superficial social conventions governing most aristocratic marriages. The moment that would define Lady Cordelia Ashworth's destiny arrived when Lord Pemberton, the hostess's son, and Alexander's distant cousin, known for his sharp tongue, decided to turn her forced solitude into a public spectacle. He approached Cordelia with an exaggeratedly elaborate bow that immediately drew the attention of nearby groups, and addressed her with words that, beneath the veneer of aristocratic courtesy, contained enough venom to poison a serpent. Pemberton commented, loudly enough to be heard by dozens, on how courageous Lady Cordelia's participation in the season's balls was, and asked if she didn't fear that her generous presence might intimidate less robust gentlemen. His words provoked muffled laughter among the nearby debutantes, and cruel smiles among some young aristocrats who considered themselves witty. The humiliation was calculated and public, designed to solidify Cordelia's position as a social pariah. Lady Margaret Fairfax, emboldened by Pemberton's example, approached with her followers and added malicious remarks about how some people seemed to confuse ballrooms with dining rooms. Her words were punctuated by giggles that echoed through the ballroom like breaking crystals. Cordelia remained motionless, her aristocratic upbringing preventing her from responding in a way that might be considered inappropriate. But the flush that rose up her neck revealed the impact of the cruel words. The Duke of Ravenshollow watched the scene unfold with growing indignation. Alexander had witnessed many manifestations of aristocracy's casual cruelty over the years, but rarely had he seen something so deliberately malicious directed at a young woman whose only crime was not conforming to society's arbitrary physical standards. More importantly, he recognized in Cordelia's silent dignity a quality of character that contrasted sharply with the pettiness displayed by her tormentors. The situation reached its climax when Lord Pemberton, intoxicated by the attention he was receiving, suggested that it might be appropriate to organize a contest to see which gentleman would be brave enough to ask Lady Cordelia for a dance. His words provoked a wave of laughter that reverberated through the marble columns like distant thunder. Even the adults present, who would normally exert some control over such excesses, seemed to consider the spectacle an acceptable form of entertainment. It was at that moment that Alexander made a decision that would reverberate through the entire London social structure. He interrupted his conversation with Lord Ashworth and strode across the ballroom with deliberate steps that made the sound of his boots echo in the sudden silence that fell upon the assembly. Everyone present immediately recognized that something extraordinary was about to happen. Dukes did not walk through ballrooms with such determination without monumental reasons. Alexander addressed Lord Pemberton directly, and, with a voice laden with the authority that only true dukes possess, expressed his curiosity about what qualities a man would need to demonstrate to be considered worthy of dancing with a lady of the Ashworth lineage and fortune. His words were chosen with surgical precision, subtly reminding everyone present that Cordelia was not just any heiress, but a member of one of England's wealthiest families. Pemberton, suddenly aware that he had attracted the attention of one of the kingdom's most powerful men, began to stammer inadequate explanations. Alexander allowed the silence to linger long enough for the entire assembly to grasp the magnitude of Pemberton's error, before turning directly to Cordelia with a bow that demonstrated genuine respect. The Duke's request for her to grant him the honor of the next dance echoed through the ballroom like an earthquake. 300 people remained in absolute silence, processing the impossibility of what they were witnessing. England's most coveted bachelor, a man who had rejected daughters of earls and marquises for over a decade, was publicly requesting a dance from the young woman who moments before had been the object of collective scorn. Cordelia, in turn, experienced a moment of shock that transcended anything her aristocratic education had prepared her for. For years, she had been invisible to society's male gaze, except when she became a target of cruelty disguised as humor. The possibility that the Duke of Ravenshollow, a man whose wealth and power were legendary, was genuinely requesting her company for a dance seemed too impossible to be real. However, Alexander's dark eyes conveyed a sincerity that could not be feigned. Cordelia realized that he was not moved by pity or some momentary impulse of gallantry, but by something deeper and more deliberate. Her acceptance, murmured in a voice that trembled only slightly, sealed a moment that would be discussed in London salons for decades to come. The waltz that followed transcended any previous experience in London social life. As Alexander offered his arm to Cordelia and led her to the center of the marble ballroom, every movement was observed with microscopic intensity by the 300 guests present. The Viennese orchestrina, sensing the historical magnitude of the moment, performed the Strauss waltz with technical perfection that transformed the music into a soundtrack for an event that would redefine established social hierarchies. Cordelia discovered, to her surprise, that the Duke of Ravenshollow was an exceptional dance partner. Alexander guided her through the complex steps of the waltz, with a natural elegance that made her movements seem graceful and coordinated. More importantly, he conversed with her during the dance, not with the superficial banalities typical of ballrooms, but with intelligent observations about art, literature, and even matters related to her father's commercial investments. Alexander had deliberately chosen topics that would allow Cordelia to demonstrate her exceptional education. When he mentioned the recently opened Italian art exhibitions at the Royal Academy, she responded with sophisticated observations about the techniques of Renaissance masters that revealed knowledge far superior to that of most debutantes. Her opinions on the works of Dickens and Thackeray showed not only that she read contemporary literature, but that she possessed the critical capacity to analyze it with depth. As they danced, Alexander perceived how remarkable Cordelia's transformation was. Removed from the humiliating context of malicious remarks, she revealed a lively intelligence and a captivating personality that had remained hidden under years of psychological defenses. Her answers to his questions were thoughtful and articulate. Her observations on social issues demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of the complexities of Victorian society. The ballroom's reaction to the dance was immediate and dramatic. Lady Pemberton, a hostess accustomed to controlling all aspects of her receptions, watched with a thinly veiled expression of shock. Lord Pemberton, responsible for Cordelia's initial humiliation, had visibly paled upon realizing that he had publicly insulted the lady who now danced with the most powerful man present. Lady Margaret Fairfax and her followers whispered furiously among themselves, trying to process how their social calculations had been completely subverted. Lord Ashworth watched the scene with a mixture of paternal pride and commercial astonishment. Edmund had spent years educating his daughter so that she could be an appropriate intellectual companion for an aristocratic husband, but he had never dared to dream that her qualities would be recognized by England's most desirable duke. The financial and social implications of a possible alliance with the Ravenshollow house were transformative. Such a connection would elevate the Ashworth family from enriched merchants to unquestionable members of the highest aristocracy. When the waltz ended, Alexander did not merely escort Cordelia back to her previous position near the columns. Instead, he formally requested the honor of escorting her to the buffet, where they could continue their conversation away from the curious ears straining to catch every word exchanged between them. This action represented an even more significant public declaration than the dance itself. Dukes did not prolong ladies' company unless their intentions were serious. In the more secluded setting of the adjacent drawing room, where elaborate tables displayed delicacies imported from across Europe, Alexander and Cordelia could converse with greater freedom. He discovered that she held well-founded opinions on the parliamentary reforms under discussion, detailed knowledge of her father's commercial operations, and intelligent perspectives on the social changes transforming industrial England. Cordelia, in turn, began to understand that Alexander's interest was not motivated by pity or momentary whim. His questions about her education, her opinions, and her perspectives on the future revealed a man who sought a genuine intellectual companion, not merely a decorative social ornament. She realized that he assessed her qualities with the same seriousness he would apply to an important business decision. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Lady Catherine Blackwood, Alexander's aunt, and one of the most respected matriarchs of London aristocracy. Catherine had observed the dance and subsequent interactions with growing interest, and approached to be formally introduced to the young woman who had captured her nephew's attention so dramatically. Her assessment of Cordelia was careful, but positive. She immediately recognized the quality of the young woman's education and character. Lady Catherine gave Alexander a meaningful look that he understood perfectly. His aunt had spent years trying to convince him to seriously consider marriage, arguing that a duke had dynastic responsibilities that transcended personal preferences. The expression in her eyes at that moment communicated cautious approval. She saw in Cordelia qualities that could make her a suitable duchess. 3 weeks after the Pemberton ball, Alexander found himself in his private library at Ravenshollow House, surrounded by correspondence demanding fundamental decisions about the future of his dukedom. The tall windows offered a view of the Grosvenor Square gardens, where autumnal leaves created a golden carpet that contrasted with the gravity of the issues weighing on his mind. His grandfather's testamentary clause had transformed a personal decision into a dynastic urgency that could no longer be postponed. On his Brazilian mahogany desk, documents detailed the financial ramifications of his situation. Should he fail to meet the testamentary requirements, Lord Pemberton, his cousin, would inherit not only half of the Ravenshollow estates, but also stakes in railway companies, shares in colonial plantations, and investments in the burgeoning steel industries that Alexander had cultivated for years. The prospect of seeing decades of administrative work in the hands of a man known for his incompetence was intolerable. However, financial considerations were only one facet of the dilemma Alexander faced. During the 3 weeks following the ball, he had continually reflected on his interaction with Lady Cordelia Ashworth. Her intellectual qualities had proven even more impressive during subsequent social gatherings. She demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of issues ranging from English colonial policy to the economic implications of new industrial technologies. More significantly was the character Cordelia had revealed under pressure. Alexander had observed how she handled London society's malicious curiosity in the weeks after the ball. Her dignity had never wavered, even when whispers and speculative glances followed her through every salon she frequented. She had developed an elegant strategy to navigate the social complexities created by the ducal attention. She remained accessible yet reserved, courteous but not effusive. The Ashworth family had behaved with equal propriety during this delicate period. Lord Edmund had never made direct references to marital possibilities, but had created natural opportunities for Alexander to interact with Cordelia in socially appropriate contexts. Intimate dinners, musical receptions, and even visits to the family's rural estates had allowed Alexander to assess Cordelia as a potential life partner, not just a social curiosity. External pressure, however, had intensified considerably. Lady Margaret Fairfax and her faction had initiated a whispered campaign to undermine Cordelia's reputation, spreading insinuations about the commercial motivations behind the ducal interest. They suggested that Alexander was being manipulated by the Ashworth fortune, conveniently ignoring that a duke with his wealth did not need financial considerations to choose a wife. Lady Catherine Blackwood had positioned herself as Cordelia's discreet defender during this turbulent period. Her observations to Alexander emphasized the practical qualities that would make Cordelia an effective duchess. Her education had prepared her to manage a complex ducal household. Her intelligence would allow her to contribute to the family's commercial and political decisions. And her experience with social cruelties had forged a resilience that would be valuable in facing the pressures of the ducal position. The critical decision arrived when Alexander received a letter from his cousin, Lord Pemberton, written in a tone that blended undue familiarity with veiled threats. Pemberton expressed his concern about rumors of Alexander's possible marriage, suggesting that marriages motivated by sentimental impulses often resulted in disastrous dynastic consequences. More disturbingly, he insinuated that he possessed information about irregularities in Lord Ashworth's commercial operations that could compromise the ducal reputation. This letter revealed to Alexander the extent of the opposition he would face if he proceeded with his marital plans. Pemberton had clearly investigated the Ashworth family looking for scandals he could exploit, and his willingness to make veiled threats demonstrated that he was prepared for an open social war for control of the ducal inheritance. The prospect of dragging Cordelia through such a conflict was disturbing for Alexander. However, Cordelia's response when he shared his concerns with her revealed the depth of her character. During a meeting in the Ashworth garden, she listened to his explanations about the family pressures and political implications of their potential marriage with remarkable serenity. Her words, when she finally responded, showed that she perfectly understood the complexities of the situation and was prepared to face any social storm that might result from their union. Cordelia expressed to Alexander that she had lived for years underestimated and belittled by London society, and that such experience had taught her that true happiness could not be found in the approval of people whose values were fundamentally superficial. If he believed she could be a suitable companion to share the responsibilities of the dukedom, she was willing to prove that his trust was justified. It was at that moment, observing the serene determination in Cordelia's eyes, that Alexander understood he had found not only a solution to his dynastic dilemmas, but a partner who would elevate his personal and professional life to levels he had never imagined possible. Alexander's decision to formally propose to Lady Cordelia Ashworth was first communicated to Lady Catherine, who received the news with evident satisfaction and warm approval. Catherine had observed her nephew for years, concerned about his reluctance to fulfill his dynastic obligations, and recognized in Cordelia qualities that transcended the typical aristocratic marital considerations. Her first action was to organize an intimate reception to introduce Cordelia to the most influential matriarchs of the Blackwood family, thus establishing a crucial base of family support. The formal proposal occurred during an elaborate dinner at the Ashworth mansion, an event Lord Edmund had orchestrated with military precision. Alexander requested a private audience with Cordelia in the family conservatory, an environment surrounded by rare orchids and jasmine that created an atmosphere both romantic and formally appropriate. His words were carefully chosen, expressing not only his desire for marriage, but also his conviction that she possessed all the necessary qualities to be an exceptional duchess. Cordelia received the proposal with a composure that masked the depth of her emotions. For years, she had resigned herself to the possibility of remaining single, aware that her physical appearance put her at a disadvantage in aristocratic marriage markets. The prospect of becoming not just a wife, but a duchess, represented such a radical transformation in her life, expectations that she needed moments to fully process the implications of the proposal. Her acceptance was articulated with an elegance that demonstrated her refined education, but Alexander perceived the genuine emotion behind her formal words. Cordelia expressed her understanding of the responsibilities that accompanied the ducal title and her determination to prove herself worthy of the trust he placed in her. More significantly, she expressed her gratitude not only for the proposed marriage, but for the genuine respect he had shown for her intelligence and character. The official announcement of the engagement caused seismic reverberations throughout the entire London social structure. Society newspapers, led by the influential Morning Post, dedicated entire pages to analyze the implications of the most surprising ducal marriage of the decade. Lady Margaret Fairfax and her faction suddenly found themselves in a precarious social position. Their public criticisms of Cordelia had transformed into implicit attacks on the choice of one of England's most powerful men. Lord Pemberton, confronted with the reality that his expected inheritance was definitively lost, launched a desperate campaign to undermine the legitimacy of the engagement. He spread rumors about irregularities in Lord Ashworth's commercial operations, suggested that the marriage was motivated by financial blackmail, and even insinuated that Alexander had been seduced by calculated feminine artifices. However, his accusations found little receptivity in a society that perfectly understood that dukes do not make marital decisions on a whim. The wedding preparations proved to be a complex exercise in social diplomacy. Lady Catherine took responsibility for guiding Cordelia through the traditions and expectations associated with ducal marriages, a process that included education on court protocol, administration of extensive estates, and navigation of the political rivalries characterizing high aristocracy. Cordelia showed remarkable aptitude for absorbing these lessons, revealing a natural capacity to understand the nuances of aristocratic power. Negotiations for the marriage contracts between Lord Ashworth and Alexander were conducted with a sophistication that reflected both men's commercial education. Edmund insisted on provisions that would protect his daughter's financial independence, including a specific property that would remain under her direct control. Alexander, recognizing the wisdom of these provisions, readily agreed and added clauses that would guarantee Cordelia active participation in the administration of the ducal domains. The choice of wedding venue became a significant political statement. Alexander decided the ceremony would take place at St. Paul's Cathedral, not a private chapel as would be more traditional for ducal families. This decision publicly communicated that he not only accepted, but celebrated the extraordinary nature of his marital choice. The cathedral's grandeur would emphasize the importance he attached to the union, publicly elevating Cordelia to the status she deserved. The wedding guest list included representatives from England's oldest families, foreign diplomats, and prominent figures from commercial and industrial circles. Alexander deliberately invited many of the merchants and industrialists with whom he had negotiated over the years, signaling that the new dukedom under his leadership would embrace modern economic realities rather than being limited to obsolete aristocratic traditions. Cordelia used the wedding preparation period to correspond with ducal estate administrators, study financial reports from various family businesses, and familiarize herself with the political complexities that would influence her life as a duchess. Her methodical approach impressed both Alexander and his advisors, confirming that she took her future responsibilities very seriously. During this period, an intellectual intimacy developed between Alexander and Cordelia that transcended the typical formalities of aristocratic engagements. Their conversations explored issues ranging from political philosophy to investment strategies, revealing a mental compatibility that promised to make their marriage a true partnership in all aspects of ducal life. The marriage ceremony at St. Paul's Cathedral represented one of the most significant social events of the 1848 season, attracting observers from across aristocratic Europe who wished to witness the union that had defied all traditional conventions of ducal marriages. Cordelia, wearing an exceptional Charles Frederick Worth creation in lion silk and adorned with Brussels lace, walked down the cathedral aisle with a dignity that definitively silenced any questioning of her suitability for the ducal title. Alexander awaited her at the altar, wearing his family's ceremonial military uniform, complete with decorations reflecting centuries of service to the English crown. His expression, closely observed by the guests, revealed not only formal satisfaction, but genuine admiration for the woman who was about to become his duchess. The presence of Queen Victoria, represented by her personal emissary, communicated royal approval for a union that had initially caused surprise in the court's more conservative circles. The reception that followed the ceremony was held at Ravenshollow's London properties, where Alexander had ordered specific modifications to accommodate the hundreds of guests representing the full spectrum of British political and economic influence. Cordelia, now Duchess of Ravenshollow, moved among the guest groups with a natural grace that demonstrated how completely she had absorbed the lessons of aristocratic protocol. However, the first months of the marriage brought challenges that tested both the ducal couple's personal union and social position. Lord Pemberton, embittered by the definitive loss of his expected inheritance, had allied himself with other aristocratic factions, discontent with the ascent of a commercial family to the highest circles of nobility. His activities included attempts to undermine Alexander's commercial investments through political pressure and whispered campaigns aimed at socially isolating the couple. Cordelia's response to these pressures revealed the extent of her personal and social transformation. Instead of retreating from hostilities, she used her intelligence and education to build strategic alliances with influential matriarchs who recognized her genuine qualities. Lady Catherine became her primary mentor in this process, introducing her to circles where her intellectual acumen was valued above superficial considerations of physical appearance. Alexander watched with growing admiration as his wife navigated the political complexities of her new position. Cordelia had assumed significant administrative responsibilities in the ducal estates, revealing remarkable talent for issues ranging from agricultural reform oversight to negotiations with emerging industrial unions. Her methodical approach and ability to understand technical details had impressed administrators who initially doubted her qualifications. The first major crisis of the marriage arrived when parliamentary investigations into labor practices in textile factories threatened Alexander's investments in northern England. Cordelia proposed a proactive strategy that involved voluntary implementation of labor reforms exceeding governmental requirements, thus transforming a political vulnerability into a competitive advantage. Her perspective revealed a sophisticated understanding of how emerging social trends could be anticipated and strategically utilized. The implementation of these reforms required extensive travel to the family's industrial properties, where Cordelia could directly observe working conditions and interact with worker representatives. Her presence in these negotiations, unusual for a duchess, but perfectly appropriate for a competent administrator, communicated seriousness about the family's commitment to ethical practices that transcended minimum legal requirements. These activities brought public recognition that gradually transformed social perception of the ducal marriage. Newspapers that had initially treated the union as a social curiosity began to praise Cordelia's substantive contribution to issues of social reform and economic development. Her correspondence with prominent social reformers, including figures like Lord Ashley, established her reputation as an aristocrat genuinely concerned with issues of social justice. Alexander discovered that his marriage had created political opportunities that transcended his traditional commercial investments. Cordelia's unique perspective on social issues, combined with her credibility among progressive reformers, had opened channels of influence that were inaccessible to traditional aristocrats. Her ability to mediate between different political factions became a valuable asset in complex parliamentary negotiations. Cordelia's social transformation reached its peak when she was invited to participate in royal commissions on educational reforms, an extraordinary recognition of her intellectual authority. Her contribution to debates on female education and literacy programs for working classes set precedents that would influence social policies for decades to come. Alexander watched with pride as his wife had become an independent political force, respected on her own merits. The marriage had proven to be not only a satisfying personal alliance, but a partnership that amplified both spouses' capabilities and influence. Cordelia had found in the ducal position a platform to exercise her intellectual capacities in ways that transcended traditional limitations imposed on aristocratic women, while Alexander had discovered that his unconventional marital choice had opened completely new dimensions of power and social influence. 5 years after their marriage, Cordelia had established herself as one of the most respected figures in English aristocracy, completely transforming initial perceptions of her suitability for the ducal title. Her influence extended far beyond the Ravenshollow estates, reaching political circles where her opinions on social reform issues were sought by members of parliament and even crown ministers. Alexander observed with deep satisfaction how his marital choice, initially controversial, had proven to be not only personally gratifying, but strategically brilliant. The ducal residence in London had become a center of intellectual activity, where writers, social reformers, economists, and politicians gathered for discussions that influenced national policies. Cordelia had created a salon in the best French style, but adapted to English sensibilities, where conversations about literature coexisted with debates on labor legislation and discussions on colonial investments. Her ability to moderate these interactions had established her reputation as one of London's most sophisticated hostesses. The family's commercial investments had prospered under Alexander and Cordelia's joint administration. She had proposed strategic diversifications that included stakes in steamship companies, investments in burgeoning German chemical industries, and even experimental shares in American telegraph companies. Her international perspective, developed through extensive correspondence with European financiers, had opened opportunities Alexander had never considered. However, the definitive test of her social position arrived when Lord Pemberton, after years of frustrated campaigns against the ducal couple, decided to make one last attempt to undermine their legitimacy. He had discovered documents related to the commercial origins of the Ashworth fortune that, although perfectly legal, could be interpreted prejudicially by traditional aristocrats who despised any association with commercial activities. His strategy involved making this information public during the most prestigious reception of the social season. The annual reception of the Dukes of Marlborough represented the pinnacle of the London season, an event where attendance was simultaneously a confirmation of social status and an opportunity to observe and influence aristocratic hierarchies. Pemberton had chosen this occasion for his calculated revelation, hoping that maximum publicity would cause enough embarrassment to permanently compromise Cordelia's social position. Cordelia received information about Pemberton's plans through a network of allies she had cultivated for years among aristocratic matriarchs. Instead of retreating or trying to avoid confrontation, she decided to face it directly, preparing a strategy that would transform Pemberton's attack into a demonstration of her own strength and legitimacy. Her response would reveal the full extent of her evolution from humiliated debutante to formidable aristocratic matriarch. On the night of the reception, Cordelia appeared wearing a specially created Worth ensemble that combined supreme elegance with an almost royal dignity. Her jewels, including diamonds that had belonged to the Blackwood family for generations, communicated her position as a legitimate and respected duchess. Alexander, observing her meticulous preparation, recognized that she was arming herself for a social battle that would permanently define her place in the aristocratic hierarchy. Pemberton initiated his attack during the formal dinner, rising to propose a toast that quickly transformed into a malicious dissertation on the importance of preserving aristocratic traditions against corrupting influences of modern commerce. His words were carefully chosen to insult Cordelia without directly mentioning her name, but everyone present perfectly understood the target of his comments. Cordelia's response was a masterpiece of social strategy and aristocratic eloquence. She waited until Pemberton had completely finished his dissertation before requesting permission to respond, demonstrating absolute control over her emotions and a perfect understanding of social protocol. When she rose to speak, her posture and expression communicated the natural authority of someone born to command aristocratic salons. Her words, when she finally uttered them, were an eloquent defense not only of her own position, but of the values of merit and social contribution that should characterize true aristocracy. Cordelia argued that the English nobility had always renewed itself through the incorporation of families who contributed to national well-being, and that attempting to preserve exclusivity through the exclusion of vitalizing elements would condemn the aristocracy to historical irrelevance. More devastatingly, she revealed detailed knowledge of the Pemberton family's own commercial origins, information she had acquired through discreet genealogical research. Her presentation demonstrated that virtually all English aristocratic families had ancestors who had accumulated wealth through commercial activities, making Pemberton's criticisms not only hypocritical, but historically ignorant. The aristocratic assembly watched in respectful silence as Cordelia systematically dismantled each of Pemberton's arguments, demonstrating not only superior knowledge of history and genealogy, but also a dignity that contrasted sharply with her attacker's pettiness. When she finished her defense, the silence that followed was broken by spontaneous applause, led by the Duke of Marlborough himself. The confrontation at the Marlborough reception proved to be a definitive transformative moment, not only for Cordelia, but for the entire social structure that had initially questioned her suitability for the highest aristocratic circles. The eloquence of her defense, and the dignity with which she had faced Pemberton's attacks, resonated through London's salons like a social earthquake that would redefine perceptions of merit, tradition, and the true meaning of English nobility. In the weeks following the reception, the repercussions of the confrontation manifested in ways that surprised even the most astute observers of London society. Lady Margaret Fairfax, who had led the initial opposition to Cordelia, approached her during a musical reception to express admiration for the way she had defended not only her own position, but the principles of aristocratic renewal that benefited all society. This public reconciliation signaled a fundamental shift in the attitudes of the younger generation of the aristocracy. Lord Pemberton, on the other hand, discovered that his final attempt to undermine Cordelia had resulted in his own social isolation. His revelations about the commercial origins of aristocratic families had created widespread embarrassment among hosts who recognized the applicability of these observations to their own genealogies. More significantly, his willingness to publicly attack a respected duchess had violated codes of courtesy, fundamental to the functioning of aristocratic society. Cordelia's vindication culminated when she received an extraordinary invitation to a private audience with Queen Victoria. Such royal recognition represented official approval for a woman who had faced initial skepticism even within court circles. During the audience, the Queen expressed admiration for Cordelia's contribution to social reform issues and her ability to worthily represent English aristocratic values. Alexander observed his wife's complete social assent with a satisfaction that transcended personal pride. His marital decision, initially made by a combination of dynastic necessity and intuitive recognition of Cordelia's qualities, had proven to be one of the most astute choices of his life. The intellectual and social partnership they had developed had enriched not only their personal lives, but also their political and economic influence. The family's commercial investments continued to prosper under their joint administration, but more important were the contributions they had made to issues of social justice and national economic development. The pioneering labor reforms implemented on their industrial properties had become models studied by reformers across Europe. Cordelia had published articles on educational issues that were cited in parliamentary debates and academic discussions. Cordelia's transformation from a young woman humiliated in ballrooms to an internationally respected duchess represented more than individual social ascent. It symbolized English society's capacity to renew itself through the recognition of genuine merit. Her story had become an inspiring narrative for other young women facing limitations imposed by rigid and often arbitrary social standards. During an intimate dinner celebrating their 5th wedding anniversary, Alexander and Cordelia reflected on the extraordinary journey they had shared. She expressed gratitude not only for the marriage that had transformed her life, but for the opportunity to prove that personal worth transcended superficial appearances. Alexander, in turn, acknowledged that his life had been immeasurably enriched by his wife's intelligence, dignity, and strength of character. The children who now blessed the ducal marriage, 2 sons and a daughter, represented not only dynastic continuity, but symbols of a new aristocratic generation, educated to value substance over superficiality. Cordelia had insisted that her children receive an education that included interaction with children from different social classes, preparing them for leadership in a transforming society. The Ravenshollow Library had expanded to include works on social reform, political economy, and moral philosophy that reflected the couple's shared intellectual interests. Their correspondence with progressive thinkers from across Europe had established the ducal house as a center of advanced ideas influencing social and economic policies. Lord Pemberton had passed away 2 years prior, isolated and embittered, his properties sold to pay debts accumulated through failed speculations. Cordelia had attended his funeral, demonstrating the magnanimity that characterized her maturity, and had discreetly arranged financial aid for his widow and children during periods of financial difficulty. This gesture had been observed and commented upon as an example of nobility of character that transcended personal resentments. Lady Margaret Fairfax, now married to a marquis and mother of 3, had become one of Cordelia's most loyal allies in aristocratic circles. Her evolution from cruel antagonist to respectful defender demonstrated how Cordelia's consistent dignity had transformed even her harshest critics. Margaret often commented that knowing Cordelia had taught her to distinguish between genuine worth and superficial appearances. Cordelia's influence extended even to royal court circles, where her opinions on social policy issues were sought by Queen Victoria's advisors. Her ability to articulate progressive positions in a way that respected traditions, while promoting necessary reforms, had made her a respected voice in debates about modernizing English society. During intimate evenings in the ducal library, Alexander and Cordelia reflected on the extraordinary journey they had shared since that first waltz that had shocked London society. Their union had transcended the most optimistic expectations, transforming into an intellectual and emotional partnership that had enriched not only their personal lives, but also their ability to contribute significantly to matters of national importance. The story of Lady Cordelia Ashworth, who had become Duchess of Ravenshollow against all conventional expectations, remained a permanent testament to the triumph of character over circumstance, intelligence over prejudice, and dignity over social cruelty. Her transformation from a young woman scorned in ballrooms to an internationally respected matriarch had redefined understandings of aristocratic merit and set precedents that would influence English society for decades to come. On quiet Ravenshollow nights, when the ducal family gathered in the library for evening readings, the children occasionally asked about the early days of their parents' marriage. Cordelia answered these questions with a serenity reflecting complete inner peace, explaining that initial adversities had proven to be blessings in disguise that strengthened character and deepened appreciation for life's true rewards. The echo of the cruel laughter that had resonated in that distant ballroom had been replaced by the sounds of a happy family and a home radiating positive influence throughout English society. The Duchess, who had once been an object of scorn, had become a symbol of hope for all those facing limitations imposed by unjust social standards, proving that true nobility resided not in conformity with superficial expectations, but in the capacity to contribute significantly to humanity's common good.